Imagine you are the 15th man in line. The water stopped being water about 10 men ago. What you are stepping into is warm, yes, but not from a stove. It is warm from the bodies of strangers. Thick with their skin and their suffering, a brownish broth that coats your legs as you lower yourself in. This is your luxury. This is your reward after 6 months on the trail. Welcome to the finest bathhouse in town. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today, you're going to learn what the American West actually smelled like, what was living inside the clothes on a cowboy's back, and why the single act of getting clean was, in many cases, one of the most biological nightmares a man could voluntarily walk into. Hollywood handed you a lie, and it smells like cedar and leather. In every classic Western, the drifter rides into town, spins a coin on the counter of a hotel, and sinks into a gleaming zinc tub of steaming hot water. He lights a cigar. He exhales. The world is good. Cut the music. Replace it with the sound of flies. The thick, wet sound of something heavy being poured. And a man scratching his forearm raw. Teeth clenched, eyes distant. That is the real scene. That is the scene they never filmed. Let's start with what the cowboys were actually wearing. Because before you understand a bath, you have to understand what was already living on their bodies. When autumn arrived on the frontier, a working cowboy pulled on his long johns, heavy wool underwear, tight against the skin, from ankle to wrist to collar, and then he did not take them off. Not for weeks, not for months. Many men wore the same set of long underwear from the first cold snap in October straight, through to the thawing ground of April or May, the same garment, against the same skin, for the better part of half a year. Now understand what wool does when it traps moisture. It holds it. It keeps it warm and close to the body. Every drop of sweat, every flake of dead skin, every trace of whatever trailed through the man, all of it was absorbed and kept pressed tight against him day after day, night after night. The garment was not clothing anymore. It was a second skin, and it was alive. Body lice thrived in those conditions. Scabies mites burrowed through softened skin, carving tunnels beneath the surface near the armpits, along the inner arms, through the lower body. Men scratched themselves constantly, not with embarrassment, but with the flat resignation of someone swatting a fly. It was simply a condition of existence. You itched, you scratched, you kept moving. The smell of a cowboy at peak trail season, standing under the full desert sun, wearing 6 weeks of the same wool layer, has been described in historical accounts as something close to rancid cheese and soured onion baked into fabric. Not a comparison that conjures romance. Not the kind of smell that makes a woman swoon from a balcony. It was a biological record of hard labor written into every fiber of man's clothes, and no amount of riding into the sunset changed that. Now let's talk about the bath. The actual bath. Water on the frontier was not a convenience. It was survival infrastructure. Every drop that had to be hauled, heated, and stored represented time and fuel and muscle. You did not use precious clean water to wash a body when that body could walk to the river on its own 2 legs. The economics of hygiene were brutally simple. Clean water was for drinking, for cooking, for the horses. The body came last, and often it came never. In towns with actual bathhouses, a man could pay somewhere between 50 cents and a full dollar for the privilege of a hot bath. That was not a small amount. For many hands, it represented a day's wages or more. It was an event, a splurge, and the bathhouse owner naturally made it worth his investment. The same water that was heated and poured for the first customer of the morning was still there for the second, and the third, and the fifth. The tub was not emptied and refilled between men. That would cost time and money and fuel that nobody was willing to spend. By the time you reached the back half of the queue, the water had transformed into something else entirely. It was lukewarm and dark, brownish gray at the surface, with a thick foam along the edges, floating in it. If you looked closely, were the remnants of every man who had gone before you, grit and trail dust and the residue of open sores and the tiny corpses of whatever had been living in the previous men's clothing. You paid your 50 cents, you walked through the door, and you sat down in all of it. The soap offered no comfort. There were no gentle formulations on the frontier. Soap was made from animal fat and lye, a caustic compound that stripped grease from iron pots and skin with equal enthusiasm. It burned on contact with any abrasion. It turned open sores into something considerably worse. Men who entered the tub with cuts from wire or rock or a poorly handled blade came out with those wounds screaming. The soap did not discriminate between dirt and flesh. It simply attacked. If the bathhouse felt like too much of an investment, or if there was no town within a week's ride, the river was the alternative. In winter, the river was a death sentence waiting for a careless foot. The cold in those open waterways was the kind that seizes muscle and steals breath in seconds, and hypothermia did not announce itself before it arrived. In summer, when the temperature made the water inviting, the river was something else entirely. It was where the cattle upstream spent their days standing and defecating. It was where towns disposed of what they did not want to think about: slaughterhouse runoff, animal carcasses too large to bury, the soft biological waste of an entire community, all of it flowing downstream to where a man might be considering getting clean. There was no winning scenario. You could bake inside your own clothing, feeding the colony of insects that had made a permanent home against your skin, or you could pay for the privilege of soaking in the concentrated misery of 15 strangers in water that had long since stopped being water, using soap designed more for industrial cleaning than for human skin, and walk out smelling only marginally different than when you walked in. Now, picture the saloon. 30 men, some of them 6 months out from their last genuine wash. The boots crusted with whatever the stable floor was made of that week. The breath of men who had not seen a functioning dentist in years, if ever, emanating in warm clouds in an unventilated room in the middle of a scorching summer. Historical accounts from journalists and travelers who passed through these towns consistently describe the physical act of walking into a crowded saloon as a confrontation. Not a smell, a confrontation. Something that hit the face like a wall. Something that burned at the back of the throat and sat there. The American frontier did not smell like gunpowder and freedom. It smelled like infection and old sweat and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into clothing and never fully leaves. The men who lived it were not romantic figures choosing grit as an aesthetic. They were human beings enduring the only conditions available to them, carrying their parasites and their suffering across a continent that offered very little mercy and absolutely no hot showers. That is not a weakness. That is survival on a scale that most of us will never be asked to comprehend. These were men who kept working, kept writing, kept building a world inside conditions that would hospitalize most modern people within a week. What would you have done? Would you have paid your hard-earned dollar to lower yourself into brown water of 14 men before you? Or would you have kept the money and kept the long johns on until spring? Leave it in the comments. We genuinely want to know where you draw the line. And if you think what was happening on the outside of these men was bad, wait until you find out what was happening inside their mouths. The dentistry of the Old West was not medicine. It was something closer to a controlled horror, performed by men with minimal training, maximum confidence, and tools that belonged in a blacksmith shop. Click on our video about the dentist's nightmare of the Old West. You will not look at a toothache the same way again. Raw, visceral, history. This is the raw frontier.